The global trade map was just set on fire. Within the last 60 seconds, reports confirmed that the most stable economic partnership in human history has officially collapsed into a state of open financial warfare. We are not talking about a minor dispute over lumber or dairy anymore. This is the moment the North American dream died. But while the media focuses on the shouting matches in Washington and Ottawa, they are missing the $500 billion ticking time bomb that just had its timer activated. You were told that tariffs were a tool to protect your job and lower your costs. Yet, the data reveals a terrifyingly different reality that is about to hit your bank account by tomorrow morning. The common belief is that Canada is too small to fight back and too dependent on the U.S. to resist. However, the contrarian truth is that Ottawa has just deployed a nuclear option in the form of a counterstrike that doesn't just target American goods, it targets the very survival of the U.S. energy grid and the stability of the American dollar. How did a dispute over border security turn into a $500 billion scorched earth policy? This brings us to the master loop. Why did the Trump administration proceed with these tariffs despite receiving a secret intelligence briefing 3 days ago that warned this exact counterstrike would trigger a domestic energy blackout? The answer to that question is being guarded at the highest levels of the Pentagon, and what it reveals about the next 30 days will change how you view your own security forever. To understand why your electricity bill is about to double, we have to look at the hidden connections no one else is brave enough to mention. The truth they are hiding is that this trade war isn't actually about trade. To see the full picture, you have to connect the dots between the February 24th Supreme Court ruling in Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump and a silent crisis unfolding in the lithium mines of South America. On February 20th, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court effectively gutted the president's power to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act for broad tariffs. This should have ended the conflict. Instead, it accelerated it. When the court ruled these tariffs unconstitutional, the administration didn't back down. They pivoted to the national security loophole under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This move was triggered by a classified report showing that China had begun routing 80% of its critical minerals through Canadian processing plants to bypass U.S. sanctions. This changes everything. This isn't just a spat between neighbors. It is a desperate attempt by Washington to prevent a North American backdoor that allows Beijing to dominate the U.S. EV and defense markets. The data is clear. While you were told the 25% tariff was about fentanyl and the border, the timing matches perfectly with the collapse of the POS lithium agreement in Argentina. The U.S. lost its primary alternative source for battery components on the same day the Canada tariffs were finalized. No one is talking about this, but the $500 billion figure isn't just a random number thrown out by Ottawa. It represents the total valuation of intertwined dependencies, specifically the cross-border energy contracts that keep the lights on in the American Midwest and Northeast. What they told you was a lie. They said Canada would cave because they need our market. But on March 4th, Ottawa didn't just tax orange juice and motorcycles. They activated the Trade Impact Program, a $11.5 billion war chest designed to pivot their entire economy toward the European Union and the Indo-Pacific. Pattern interrupt. Did you know that 60% of the crude oil used in U.S. refineries comes from a single pipeline system that Canada now has the legal authority to throttle in national interest? This is the hidden connection. The U.S. is trying to block China, but in doing so, they have accidentally given Canada the leverage to hold the American energy sector hostage. The master loop remains. Why would the White House risk a national blackout for a trade policy that the Supreme Court already labeled unconstitutional? The stakes involve more than just gas prices. They involve a strategic chess match where the board has been flipped. As we move into the inner sanctums of power, we see that the players involved are no longer speaking the language of diplomacy. They are speaking the language of extraction. The next move doesn't happen at a border crossing. It happens inside the boardrooms of the world's most powerful central banks. To understand the real motives, you have to look past the podiums of Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump. The real architects of this $500 billion counterstrike are sitting in the headquarters of the IMF and the back offices of the WTO. The Pentagon has secretly designated the Great Lakes region as a critical failure zone. They know that if Canada follows through on its threat to limit electricity exports, The manufacturing heartland of the U.S., Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania will see its industrial output drop by 40% in a single quarter. Yet, the Trump administration is pushing forward. Why? Because the strategy isn't about winning a trade war. It's about forced integrated annexation. Insiders suggest that the goal is to break the Canadian economy so thoroughly that Ottawa has no choice but to accept a new security and prosperity treaty that effectively ends Canadian sovereign control over its natural resources. Trudeau's successor Mark Carney has framed this as a fight for the very soul of the country. Carney, a former governor of the Bank of England, knows exactly which levers to pull. He isn't just using tariffs. He is orchestrating a capital flight maneuver by signaling that Canada will no longer be a safe harbor for American investment. He is forcing the EU and Japan to choose sides. The WTO has already received a record-breaking 400-page filing from Ottawa alleging that the U.S. has committed the single largest breach of international trade law in the post-World War II era. This changes everything. The IMF has issued a gray alert for the North American corridor, predicting that this conflict will shave 1.5% off global GDP by the end of the year. But the power players in Washington believe the risk is worth the reward. A total restructuring of the global supply chain that moves the center of gravity back to U.S. soil regardless of the cost to its allies. Pattern interrupt. If you think your savings are safe, consider this. The Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board just began offloading $20 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds to fund their domestic resistance fund. What they told you was a lie. This isn't a negotiating tactic to get a better deal on the USMCA. It is a fundamental divorce. The WTO is powerless to stop it because the U.S. has effectively paralyzed their appellate body. The master loop is still pulsing. Why would the White House ignore the secret intelligence warning about the energy grid? The answer lies in a document known as Project 2026, Resource Sovereignty, which outlines a plan to nationalize certain cross-border assets if Canada retaliates. Every move you see on the news is a distraction from the real goal, the total control of the 21st century's most valuable resource, fresh water and hydroelectric power. The $500 billion counterstrike isn't just about money. It's about who controls the on-off switch for the North American continent. But while these giants clash in the clouds of high finance, the economic fallout is descending on your doorstep. You are about to become the collateral damage in a war you didn't vote for. This is where the high-level strategy hits your wallet with the force of a freight train. You were told that tariffs would tax the foreigners. The data is clear. You are the one paying the bill. According to the OECD, the average American family will see an immediate tariff tax of $4,200 added to their annual cost of living by the end of next month. This isn't an abstraction. It is the cost of your groceries, your gas, and your car insurance. Because the U.S. and Canadian auto industries are so integrated, a single car part often crosses the border 7 times before the vehicle is finished. With a 25% tariff applied at each crossing, the price of a standard domestic truck is projected to skyrocket by $12,000 overnight. But it gets worse. Canada provides 20% of U.S. agricultural imports. We're talking about basic fertilizers, wheat, and potash. Without Canadian potash, U.S. crop yields in the Midwest are forecasted to drop by 15% this season. This means that while you're standing in the grocery aisle, the price of bread, pasta, and even meat will hit levels we haven't seen since the stagflation of the 1970s. The World Bank has warned that food insecurity is no longer a term reserved for developing nations. It is coming to the suburbs of North America. No one is talking about this, but your energy bill is the real casualty. The $500 billion counterstrike includes a reciprocity surcharge on all energy exports. Since the U.S. Northeast relies on Quebec and Ontario for a massive portion of its peak load electricity, you are looking at a 100% increase in utility costs during the coming summer months. Pattern interrupt. Imagine waking up and finding that your local gas station is charging $7 a gallon, not because of a war in the Middle East, but because of a tax dispute in North Dakota. This changes everything for your job security. Companies like Ford, GM, and Stellantis are already issuing temporary operational suspensions. They cannot afford the 25% hit on their supply chains. This isn't just about lost profits, it's about the permanent closure of manufacturing plants that have stood for 50 years. The truth they are hiding is that the US dollar is losing its exclusivity premium as Canada pivots to the euro and the yuan for its trade settlements to avoid US banking surcharges. The demand for the greenback is softening. This is the wallet bleed that no one warns you about. The slow, steady erosion of your purchasing power. The master loop remains. Why would the administration risk this level of domestic economic carnage? The secret intelligence briefing mentioned earlier explicitly warned that these economic fallout zones would become political volatility zones within 60 days. If the government knows this will happen, they must have a reason for letting the fire burn. To find that reason, we have to look at the next 30 days. The timeline is already set, and the first domino has already fallen. We are now entering the danger zone. The data-backed timeline for the next month suggests a sequence of events that will be irreversible by the time the public realizes what is happening. In week 1, there is an 85% probability that the Canadian government will finalize its non-tariff barrier list. This isn't just about taxes, it's about regulatory slowdowns. Expect to see 5-mile-long lines at every major border crossing from Windsor, Detroit to Peace Arch. This will immediately trigger, just in time, supply chain failures. If you are waiting for a computer, a car part, or even specialized medical supplies, the delay will jump from 3 days to 3 weeks. In week 2, look for the currency shock. There is a 70% probability that the Bank of Canada will announce a strategic interest rate shift designed to devalue the Canadian dollar, specifically against the euro, making U.S. goods prohibitively expensive for Canadian consumers. This will result in a ghost shelf phenomenon in Canadian retail. American brands will simply vanish, replaced by domestic or European alternatives. For the U.S. worker, this means the immediate loss of their largest export market. In week 3, the energy pivot begins. This is the most dangerous phase. There is a 60% probability that Hydro-Quebec will announce maintenance-related reductions in power transmission to the U.S. grid. This is the soft blackout strategy. It won't be a total darkness, but brownouts will become a daily reality in Boston and New York City. The goal is to make the American public feel the cost of the tariffs in their own homes. By week 4, the corporate exodus will accelerate. Major tech and manufacturing firms will begin announcing the relocation of their headquarters to neutral zones like Ireland or Singapore to escape the cross-border tax trap. Pattern interrupt. If you think this is a temporary dip, remember that in 1930 the Smoot-Hawley tariff was supposed to be a short-term fix. It ended up lasting 10 years and fueling the Great Depression. The probability of a full-scale North American recession by the end of this 30-day window is now estimated at 65% by Goldman Sachs. The master loop is about to be closed. We are seeing the deliberate dismantling of an economic empire. Why would they do this? Why would the administration ignore the warnings of a domestic energy collapse and a $500 billion counterstrike? The truth is far more calculated than a simple trade dispute. The master loop can finally be resolved. The reason the Trump administration ignored the secret intelligence briefing warning of a domestic energy blackout is because the blackout is the objective. By forcing a national energy crisis, the administration gains the emergency authority needed to seize control of private energy infrastructure and bypass environmental regulations that have blocked domestic drilling and nuclear expansion for decades. The tariffs aren't the end goal. They are the controlled chaos required to force a total state-led overhaul of the American energy and industrial base. The true cost is devastating. You are being used as a pawn in a high-stakes shock therapy experiment. The $500 billion counter-strike from Ottawa was anticipated, welcomed, and factored into a plan to break the old system so a more insular America can be built from the ashes. Your higher bills and lost job security are considered acceptable friction in a war for 21st century dominance. Earlier we discussed how the Supreme Court tried to stop this and how the energy grid is the ultimate lever. But there is a second, even darker layer to this story involving the secret bilateral water divergence project that will determine which half of the continent survives the next decade of drought. Out.